camera is that I'm a person with a disability as well, and I'm a wheelchair user. And so not only is this a lived experience for me, but it's an experience within my own personal growth as well as my career development. So I'm going to go ahead and share one of my presentation now. There we go. So I'm hoping that everyone can see the screen. Yeah, so as you know, this presentation is about 5 easy steps or changes that you can make to make your business more accessible. But I want to expand that a little bit. This is more than just about business. This is actually about public spaces and the places that we go. You know, in my experience as an accessibility and inclusion consultant, I can tell you that I've really learned that people want to see themselves reflected in the places they live, work, play, and learn. And so the ways in which we can do that are going to be far and wide from just these 5 tips. But I'm hoping that with these 5 tips, I'm able to lead you down a pathway of how you can get started in your own public space, whether you're a facilities manager, somebody running a business, or you simply just want to create environments that are more inclusive. My goal is that we're going to be able to do this for a wide variety of different people. And these are sort of the tips I've gathered along the way that make it easier to do that. So let's take a deeper look at what I'm going to cover today. Making your recruitment process more accessible. So even if you're not an employer and you're not necessarily recruiting people with disabilities or recruiting people at all, I have to tell you that businesses that do reflect that they're hiring people with disabilities or people just in general in the community, as I said, that reflect everyone that you live and work with, it actually creates a more inclusive environment. And so I found that actually building in a recruitment process to be able to have the steps in place to hire more people with disabilities, in turn, it actually welcomes more people in the community that you're working with in general, simply because they feel as though they're welcome there. Then we're going to talk about communicating with confidence. This is more about communication in general. What are some tips and tricks in terms of language and interacting with people with disabilities? It's not as hard as you think. Being mindful of unintended barriers, things like signage, plexiglass, which I'm sure we're all used to now with COVID, and many more. Is your workplace or community space accessible? Keeping hygiene in mind. Obviously, with the pandemic, you know, we've had to keep hygiene more in mind, but what works for some people doesn't necessarily work for others, and we're going to cover that. And then having an accessibility review, having somebody like an accessibility professional come into your space, be able to give you some tips, be able to look at the things that you wouldn't necessarily consider otherwise. That's exactly why they're there. You don't have to do this alone. There are experts that are out there that are really willing to help you. And in fact, I know the Museum of Surrey specifically has actually utilized the services of an accessibility professional, and they've got some amazing changes coming down the way in terms of being really inclusive for people with disabilities. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that later. And then at the very end here, we're going to have some time for questions and answers if you have any. Okay, so with that, let's go right into it. So creating an accessible recruitment process. Now, full disclosure, the reason I know about this is actually I had the opportunity to be an accessibility and inclusion consultant with a group called the President's Group. And this is a group of 25 change-driven BC business leaders, everything from Fortune 500 companies all the way down to small mom and pop pie shops. And I started with the President's Group, excuse me, in 2017. And the really cool thing is how does a consultant work for 25 companies? What do they call home base? And for me, I was fortunate enough that the co-chair of the President's Groups, one of the companies that was involved as a best practice leader in creating inclusive spaces, is actually Vancity Credit Union. And Vancity was incredible because the co-chair of the President's Group, Tamara Vrooman at the time, was the CEO of Vancity. And she said, well, if these consultants are going to help us to create more inclusive workspaces for not only these 25 companies, but for companies across British Columbia by sharing our tips and tricks and best practices, then they have to call one of our locations home base. And so she was really kind enough to say, how about when we onboard these consultants, we onboard them at Vancity as though they're Vancity employees, and they have to go through all of the same HR processes that anybody who was starting at Vancity had to go through. Now, I thought that this was really cool, but of course, at the time, I'd never applied for a role as a consultant for 25 companies. So I have to say I was a bit nervous because being a person with a disability myself, there was definitely some red alerts or signs with other companies in the past that would make me go, are they trying to screen me out? And I remember that with Vancity, their application process at the very first page, it actually said, do you identify as one of these minority groups? And persons with disabilities was listed there. Now, normally I would be super nervous about a question like that. As I said, typically speaking, people with disabilities, oftentimes if they're asked to disclose disability, they're nervous about that because they think that potentially it's going to lessen their chances of getting the job. But in this case, this was specifically for a role about accessibility and inclusion. So I figured that this wasn't actually there to screen me out. So I went through the process, and I'm happy to say that out of 88 applicants, I was one of only 2 consultants selected to work with the President's Group. Well, I later found out when I was sitting with the HR team at Vancity, I asked them, why is it that you had that question right off the bat? I'm so curious. And they told me that this actually wasn't to screen people out of the application process. It was actually to screen them in. So let me explain. If candidate A has a disability and they have all of these lists of skills, and candidate B has the same set of skills but didn't necessarily indicate in any way that they had a disability, Vancity had learned that many times people with disabilities will put on their cover letter that they have a disability or that they require some form of accommodations, and for one reason or another, employers in the past would not necessarily give them the opportunity to a face-to-face interview. So to circumvent this, Vancity was thinking outside the box. They said this is not affirmative action. We're not saying that the person with the disability is guaranteed the role by identifying they're part of a minority group, but rather we want to give them the opportunity to show up fully and present themselves in a way that they may not have gotten the chance to. Perhaps they didn't even get past a phone interview. And I thought that that was absolutely incredible that they were thinking of this. You see, as I said, even if you're not an employer, by doing actions like this and by seeing things of them out in the community, they were already showing me prior to even applying to this that they were an inclusive employer, a space that I would feel welcome. I knew this because I, used to see Vancity at many different events. At the Inclusive Employer Awards for the City of Surrey, they've always been either a gold or platinum sponsor. I've also seen them posting on social media all the time about why inclusion matters, and they even featured employees with disabilities. So this goes to show you that no matter what space you're in, whether it's a public space or a business of any kind, people are actually looking to your business just the same as you would look or do research on them before hiring them. They're looking to see, are you inclusive? Are you talking the talk and walking the walk? And so with that, I want to dive into what does it look like to create an inclusive recruitment process. This is one of the many documents that I created through the President's Group. The website we created is accessibleemployers.ca. I did provide these resources to the team at the City of Surrey, so they are available for you. Any resource that I bring up will be available for you after the presentation today. So I do welcome you to ask them for those resources if you're interested in them. But let's look at the recruitment process and what makes it accessible. Writing an inclusive job posting. Now, review the essential functions of the job. What is actually essential, and what are the skills that are absolutely needed to perform this job? So consider the language that you're using around the job. Does it speak specifically to the requirements and the needs of the job? The reason I bring this up is a lot of the times, somebody will be applying for, say, a marketing position. And a lot of the old job postings out there would say things like, must be able to lift 50 pounds, or you must have a valid driver's license. Well, my question to you is, what does being able to lift 50 pounds have to do with being an excellent marketer? Right? So was this an artifact sort of requirement that was there from a template and nobody removed it? And also, is it absolutely required that the person has a driver's license, or is it required that they're able to get from point A to point B? And with that in mind, here's a sample of some qualifications. So here's some language that could create barriers when you're creating applications or things like that. 10 years experience in a medical administration in a medical office. Well, what about looking at it from an inclusive standpoint? So experience working as a medical administrator, including managing patient appointments and requests and communicating with healthcare partners. You see how the second one there is much more specific. It gives ideas to the person who's reading it exactly what's to be expected of them. And we found that individuals who say are on the autism spectrum, it's a really valuable thing to be able to say specifically what is going to be asked of the candidate should they get the job, so they know exactly what they're in for. Here's that example I brought up about the valid driver's license. Valid driver's license required. Why not the ability to travel and provide own transportation between something like Surrey, Burnaby, and Vancouver offices, if that's the case? Now, this just means that that person's going to, if they are utilizing transit or Ubers or taxis or whatever the case may be, they just have to make sure that they're able to commute between these offices. It doesn't necessarily mean that they need that driver's license in all positions. And so this is why it's important to clarify that. Use simple language. So keep your description simple and to the point. And consider a statement about your organization's diversity and inclusion. Now, this is Vancity's. I'm going to zoom in here. Now, you can see here that they really are making sure that they're saying that they value diversity in the workplace, and they know that it takes a lot of different creativity, a breadth of experience, these kinds of things. These are probably pretty typical diversity and inclusion statements that you've seen before. In terms of being accepting of people's gender, sexual orientation, marital status, disability, so on and so forth. But the real key line here is actually the bottom line here. And I want you to remember this if you're a public space provider as well, because you could actually have this on your website in case somebody needs accommodations if they're coming into your space and they just didn't know what things were available. Do you have ASL interpreters available or services that would replace an ASL interpreter? Do you have alternative formats? These kinds of things. So if you're a job seeker with a disability and you would like someone to contact you about individualized application support, Vancity actually has People Support Center at vancity.com or a phone number that you can call. How easy is it to set up a support email address for accommodations or even a phone number? Somebody that you can point to that if somebody is coming into your space, you can provide those accommodations well in advance. And not only is that person going to feel welcome and included in the space that you're creating, but the likelihood of them telling their friends and family members that this is a space where they feel included and that other things have been considered is way more likely. So this is something that I hope that you take away with you when you think about that. Now, as I mentioned, considering alternative formats, are your job postings and website materials available in various formats? So for example, accessible PDFs that are legible to screen reading technology. Do you have alt text on things like your images that provide descriptions of what is in the image if you have documents that are printed out or that you have documents rather that are digital that somebody could say, oh, there's a person here that is smiling. It's important for somebody to know that so they understand the various contexts, or even just having large print options available. So if you normally print your materials in say 12-point font, having 18-point font and having an option where somebody who has limited vision could be able to use magnification tools to be able to do that. You can take this a step further as well. On your website, consider things like your videos. Do you have captions that is hard-coded, what we call it hard-coded in the videos? By that I mean, it's not something that you toggle on and off, but rather that you actually have had hard-coded and embedded directly on the video itself so that the captions are automatically there. People think that captioning services are really expensive, when in reality, there are alternative ways in which you can provide captions for yourself that I'm going to let you in on. There's a website called capwing.com, Kapwing.com, and they have a captions tool through Capwing that if you sign up for their account, it's free, that a video up to even including, I think it's like 8 minutes, that you can use AI-generated technology to generate the captions in real time over top of your video and then re-export your video so that you can re-upload it on your website with captions. Now, it takes no time at all. The AI generates the captions for you, and you can edit the captions before you actually export and publish the video. So that's a tip that I give to people as well. They're saying, well, captioning videos are so expensive. We're having this alternative formats. And this actually works well for people not just in the disability community, but for patrons overall. How many times have you been on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you're just scrolling through your feed looking for something interesting when a video captures your attention? Well, why not have that video have captioning? That way, if somebody isn't listening to it with sound, you're automatically seeing the words that are popping up so that even if you are able to unmute it and hear the sound, at least you're being pulled in by the text. So for all you people who are looking for new ways of marketing your space post-COVID and bringing new people in or bringing people in for jobs, that's a fantastic way of doing it just by providing alternative formats. And provide your contact details. So we already saw this through Vancity's approach. They provided contact details of any questions that somebody could answer or ask rather prior to being in an interview process or even after the fact, after getting hired on with a team. So going from there, we want to talk about communicating with confidence. So now you've done the steps it takes to kind of remove attitudinal barriers. You're helping for people to have a better understanding of the fact that you're an inclusive space and you want people with disabilities to come. I mean, that's always been the kind of crazy thing for me to think about is a lot of employers and public spaces will say to me, well, Marco, we would work on our accessibility strategy, except that we never have patrons with disabilities come to our facility. So, and I thought, well, do you maybe think that they never came to your facility because they don't have an ability to get here? They didn't know that you were accessible. You didn't have a ramp or an automatic door for them to be able to get in. And of course, the communication factor is also really important, but it's not something that you have to be nervous about. You know, there's a lot of different terminology, language, there's a lot of different preferences, and I'm going to dive into a little bit of that for you so that you know that it's not something to be scared of. Now, when you think of speaking to people with disabilities here in the Lower Mainland, specifically in BC, we are very pro person-first language. Okay, so for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use person-first language, although that doesn't necessarily mean that that is absolutely the standard for every single person you're going to come in contact with. So when I say person-first, I mean referring to someone as a person with a disability, a person who uses a walker or a scooter, a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. And you can see the list there, it goes on and on. But, you know, in some communities, they actually prefer what is called identity first. So autistic person, putting the disability before the term person. So I always put up here, this can vary depending on community to community, group to group, depending on who you're speaking with. So it's always important to ask the group what their preferences are. And I always say that if you're ever having any written materials, you can alternate between using the terms persons with disabilities are accepted here. You could say autistic people, you can say diverse abilities, but to be quite honest, as a person with a disability myself, I don't really like terms like differently abled or diverse ability or things like this, because I feel personally that it's sugarcoating something that I'm not ashamed of. I'm proud to be part of the disability community, so I'm proud to be called a person with a disability. But again, that's going to vary from person to person, which is why it's so important to ask. Remember the golden rule, okay? In all of this, just treat someone the way that you would wish to be treated. I mean, I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but I think we always feel as though we're going to trip up on our words or we're going to say the wrong thing. So just treat someone the way you wish to be treated and put the person first. Remember their humanity. Remember that they are a person before they are any kind of disability or condition that you can see or not see, because there's invisible conditions as well. Autism, learning disabilities, anxiety and depression. These are some of the things that you wouldn't necessarily see on the surface, but somebody may be going through some challenges themselves, and it's important that we put their person first, their humanity first. So what about expressions? Now, I know as a wheelchair user, I've had people get uncomfortable with things like "let's go for a walk," or for my friends who are have low vision or who are blind, somebody saying, "Oh, it's nice to see you," and then tripping up on their words, going, "Oh, I'm so sorry," or "I haven't heard from you for in a while," to someone who's deaf, or "Did you see that?" Now, In most cases, these terms are just common nomenclature, and it's absolutely fine to say these things, and the likelihood of someone getting offended is not very likely. I think it comes down to intention. Okay, so not to feel worried about saying terms like this because we're so used to hearing them, right? Now, if someone uses a wheelchair like myself, I might still say I'm going for a walk, even though I might be rolling along. I might say I'm going for a wheel. So don't feel uncomfortable for inviting them for a walk and feeling as though that's going to make things awkward. But of course, if you're going to use terms like, what, are you blind? Or what, are you deaf? Or that's so retarded. I mean, obviously, these are examples of things that we would want to avoid. And that's simply because it comes down to intention. If you're using this terminology with malicious intent, I don't think that anybody would like to hear these types of things. It's easy. Talk to the person first, not that the person that they're with. Okay, my wife does not have a disability in any regard. Okay, she's an able-bodied person, so when we're out, it's pretty natural for, say, servers at bars or other people to assume that she's my sister, or there's no way that she could be my wife, right? Because she's able-bodied, and they often will talk to her first, assuming that because I'm in a wheelchair, that I don't intellectually understand them. But obviously, this is not something that you want to jump to. Make sure that you're speaking to the person that you're wanting to communicate to first. Don't look at look at them and not their attendant or the interpreter. I know with things like ASL interpreters, it's really difficult when they're moving their hands to kind of not feel like you have to look away and look at the interpreter because they're providing that communication. But remember, that interpreter is there to provide a voice for the individual, and the individual you're connecting with is the person themselves. So as I said earlier, make no assumption about a person's ability or their disability, and go with your gut. Now, other expressions that you might want to avoid are labels, things that would be unflattering. Obviously, like she's insane or he's a schizo. Using words like challenged or handicap, I really have a problem with. And the reason for that is actually the origins of the words. It's so important to understand the origin of where something comes from. Now, I've been told a number of times that the word handicap comes from various origins. But one of the origins that really sticks out to me, whether this is true or not, is that early in, say, the 1800s, when people with disabilities were left on the streets many times to fend for themselves, a lot of the times that they would become buskers in order to, make ends meet, so to speak, on the street. They would dance, they would sing, they would perform in some sort of way. And oftentimes they would use a cap in order to collect the cash that they were receiving. And walkers by would say, well, isn't that a handicap? Now, I don't know if that origin is true, but when I heard that, it really struck me. Even if the origins of the term handicap don't come from that, think about it this way. If you're playing golf with a handicap, you're playing with a disadvantage. Right? So we don't want to label people as disadvantaged. We want to make sure that we're giving people as much opportunity as they can to bring their full self in any scenario. Another term that I truly, truly despise is the word cripple. I don't know why, but it just makes you think of like a crushed up can or something like that. Right. And of course, when it comes to the invisible disabilities like mental health or mental illness, avoid the things that create stigmas like, oh, she needs to take her happy pills, or he's psycho, or he's a lunatic. And then, of course, words that restrict. I can't believe this, but even in the media today, you still see terms like wheelchair bound man says he'll walk someday. Wheelchair bound? The last time I checked, I wasn't bound physically to my chair with a rope, right? So this terminology, I was told by a journalist recently, actually comes from the approved terms for journalists internationally, and they have a booklet on this. And I said, well, you need to tell them to change those terms because I'm not suffering from my disability. I may be affected by my disability, but I'm definitely not a victim of cerebral palsy, right? So we have to really change the way that we're approaching the language of the people that we're interacting with and how we're saying these things, because it's truly hurtful and it's not creating a space where people are going to want to come to your public space or to your business. Now, what about terms of various pieces of equipment that we use? There's some really neat things out there. And of course, if you have customers or a potential employee or just someone in the community and they come in and they're using a device and you're wondering what some of these devices are called, it's kind of neat to be able to know some of these things. So instead of a handicap parking sign, use the term accessible parking or universal parking spot. Accessible washroom. A manual wheelchair or a day chair is a standard wheelchair that's not a power chair. Now, again, power chair, not electric chair, right? Because electric chair is something that criminals get. We definitely don't want to mix up the two, okay, of an electric chair or a power chair. A scooter, a sports wheelchair, or in my case, I would call that a basketball chair because I use that for wheelchair basketball. It's got slanted tires so that I can turn quickly on the basketball court. A white cane, a guide dog or service dog, para-ice sledge, or what you would know as sledge hockey. Now, the city of Surrey has done incredible things with some of their facilities. The Surrey Sport and Leisure Ice and Leisure Complex is incredible for inclusivity because the boxes and benches for players is actually clear plexiglass in areas so that if you are a para-ice sledge player, you can actually still see what's going on the ice at ground level. So, it doesn't take much to make these changes, but it goes a long way. All right. So if somebody has a prosthetic leg, a prosthesis, a hearing aid, or a cochlear implant. A cochlear implant is so cool. My dad was actually asking me about it the other day. It's like a hearing aid, but it's a little bit different in the fact that there is a surgery that takes place where they actually hardwire some technology that goes right into the nerve endings in your cochlear, in your ear, so that the sound can go directly into your ear. And then you have a device that's connected with a magnetic device on the back of your skull, which is really, really cool. And some of this technology has things like T-coil technology or Bluetooth technology, where when you enter a space, if you're a hearing aid user or a cochlear implant user with that technology, you can actually have the PA system or announcements directly fed into your device. So we truly are getting into the 21st century here with some of the technology that we have. But the point of this slide is to have you not feel bashful about asking somebody about their device. Many times their devices are an extension of someone's personality, right? And I know that for me, my wheelchair is definitely an extension as to who I am as a person. I love the color red. If you can see the background in my office here, so my wheelchair is red and black, right? And I have a lot of things to me where I would accessorize my wheelchair just in the same way as I would accessorize a t-shirt or shoes or things of this nature, right? So here's some final tips here. When interacting with people with disabilities, depending on their disability, ask them how you can help. Allow the person to tell you how they'd like to be helped. This is so vital. Never make assumptions. So if they say no, please do listen. If there's a piece of equipment that you know that you have that could help them, let them know about it. If you have spare wheelchairs or loaner chairs at your facility that they have, or if you have an adapted fitness kit at your rec or fitness facility, let them know, hey, by the way, these things are available if you're in need of them. And of course, let them know that you're available if they need your support in any way. So now avoid trying to relate to the person based on their disability. This is a crazy one, but I've had people come up to me and say, man, that's a crazy wheelchair you've got there. And one time I broke my leg and I was like in a cast for like 2 weeks, man, and it sucked. Now, obviously, hearing things like that, that person is not trying to be malicious. They're trying to be relatable. They're trying to relate to a time in which they know what it was like to have accessibility restrictions. But of course, breaking your leg and being born with a permanent disability is not quite the same. So before you think about coming out with an anecdote like that, maybe just think about it before you say it, right? So never speak to a person as though they're not there. So you may make assumptions about someone's cognitive ability just because of what you can see, but don't assume that the person can understand you, even if they're not nonverbal. Make sure that you give the person the chance to speak for themselves. For mobility users, always ask before you touch someone's wheelchair. This is going to sound really crazy, but I've had a number of people, if I'm wheeling in, say, downtown Vancouver, or even just around town in Surrey, and I have people, all of a sudden, I'm wheeling up, say, Granville Street, which is a pretty steep hill, rightfully so, and I'm wheeling and I've got, say, earbuds in, I'm listening to music, and then all of a sudden, I feel this gush of wind behind me, and I always hope and pray that it's going to be a friend or family member. But every time I turn around, 9 times out of 10, it is a complete stranger. And so I'll take my earbud out and I'll go, I'm sorry, can I help you? Oh, no, I'm helping you. I saw that you were struggling and I wanted to give you a hand, so don't worry about it. But I want you to think about this from the context of if you weren't a wheelchair user, especially now with COVID, would you run up and just touch someone? Or if I were to run up and grab your shoulders, I'm pretty sure you would think I was trying to assault you in some way. So make sure that if you are planning on supporting someone, tap them on the shoulder. Or if you are close to them, say, hey, you look like you're having some trouble there. Could I maybe give you a hand? Always ask the person, right? Wheelchair users, it's important that, we see the chair as an extension of their personal bubble. So don't lean on the wheelchair. I know it seems like if you're tired there and you're standing, you maybe want to lean on their handle or lean on their chair. But remember that that person does want their personal space as well. You can sit down and be eye level with the person if possible. It's not necessary to like lean right in and feel like you're doing that and to reduce the bubble. Or sometimes people will take a knee, but you don't necessarily have to take a knee if you want to be at eye level with a person with a disability. I've actually had people say the opposite, say that they felt offended that somebody took a knee as though that they felt that they had to get down to their level. So you could simply ask the person, hey, do you mind if I grab a chair so I can sit next to you and look at you eye to eye? Or, you can do any number of things. You can take a knee, but just make sure you ask the person if that's cool. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, for many people, their mobility device, whether it's a wheelchair like mine or a crutch or a cane, they'll maybe accessorize it. So they'll color it pink because it's their favorite color. And they're going to have it reflect them. One thing I didn't mention is that my wheelchair has really cool lights that I can turn on that are both functional and cool, because at nighttime I turn them on and the sides of my chair and the back of my chair light up. And that's also great for not getting hit by cars in the middle of the night. So yes, it is practical, but it also is funky and cool. And I know that I have a lot of young kids that come up to me and say, that's cool, that's neat, I want to learn more. And then they ask me questions at an early age about my disability because they don't have any filter, and that's okay. I think it's interesting when I'm out in public spaces and I see parents and they shush their child because they don't want, when they say, mommy, what's wrong with that man? And the parent will shush their child. But if you see a situation like that, or if you have the urge to create a situation like that, remember why your child is being inquisitive. I think that the more we have people afraid of asking questions, the more those people grow up to be individuals who are afraid to ask questions like this. And ultimately, they won't approach situations like this in an empathetic way. So, you know what? Don't stifle the growth and learning and understanding of these children. Help them to understand in a really meaningful way that is inclusive. Now, what about people who are blind or who have low vision? I think about my friend Grant, who works for Accessible Media Inc., and all the times that we've interacted, and my wife, who works at the City of Surrey. She's actually the Universal Design and Accessibility Specialist. And she did some amazing things when Grant was coming in and doing a story as a journalist, as a blind journalist, because she already knew sort of the context. But for Grant, this was the first time ever that somebody had done something that she did, and I'll explain that in a second. So if somebody is blind or has low vision, introduce yourself and anyone else who's in the interaction. Just because you can see those people doesn't mean that they know exactly who's around you or that they're completely blind. So if you're going to pass someone who's visually impaired, make sure that you let them know what side you're passing them on. So, hey, I'm just about to pass you on your left. That way, if they were about to lunge out to the left and go to the washroom or something, that they're not about to trip or bump into you. Now, assume that they can see you, because many individuals who are blind actually do have some partial vision, right? Never grab or touch someone without them knowing. A specific story I have to this one is really actually traumatizing in a way. I was waiting for a SkyTrain at one point, and I saw an individual who was blind waiting for the SkyTrain as well. He was behind the yellow line. And I guess the SkyTrain pulled up and the doors opened, and he was taking a few seconds to think about what he wanted to do. Now, I could tell that there was somebody who had vision, who was next to them, and maybe thought that the individual didn't know that the train arrived. So they thought they were going to do this person a solid, and they started to pull this person into the direction of the train, with that person not knowing what was going on. And of course, this person started to scream, don't touch me, don't touch me. And the person who was not blind was actually offended in the moment and said, hey, I was just trying to help you. But imagine what that would be like if you, for example, had your eyes closed, or you're blind, you can't see anything, and now you're being pulled towards where you know electricity is. So rightfully so, this person was definitely, a little scared about what direction they were being pulled in, very similar to my story about people coming up behind me and pushing me, right? So ask them how they would like to be guided. This is exactly the example I was referring to with my wife. When Grant first came to do a story on City Hall, she actually said to Grant, how is it that you'd like to be guided? Did you want me to, did you want to take my elbow, or do you prefer to put your hand on my shoulder while I'm guiding you along the way? And I remember Grant was completely floored by this and was just like, wow, thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate that. No one has ever asked me the ways in which I prefer to be guided before. So to know that you were giving me the option, or that there are other options that I prefer that I could tell you just by simply asking, it means a lot. Now, offer to provide them a tour of your space. Let them know where some of the key features are. If you know that the washroom is, say, 20 feet ahead of you, let them know, hey, 20 feet ahead of you and to the right is the men's washroom. Or, there's some really interesting, there's a stairway in front of you that's a little bit spirally. It's an interesting staircase, so just be careful if you're walking forward, because it does turn sharply all of a sudden. So give them that sort of peace of mind. Give them a little bit of a tour of what's there, just so that they can assess and understand the space and navigate it on their own later on in the interactions. Now, provide clear verbal cues, like I just said. So on your left, and there's a set of 5 stairs ahead of you. Letting them know the specific amount of stairs in some cases is actually good. That way they know exactly when the staircase ends as well. Now, if you're someone who's hard of hearing or deaf, try to get the person's attention, or use visual cues or gentle touches on the arm. Speak clearly and normally, and avoid over enunciating. I know that there's probably, it probably seems like default that you want to over enunciate your words and talk a little slower, so that if they're reading your lips, they can understand what you're saying. But if you do it that way, and they're not used to you doing that, then they're not going to have any idea what you're saying, because they've become accustomed to reading lips at a normal pace, right? So don't shout or speak unnaturally slow, as I just mentioned. Face the person and make eye contact with them. Use gestures. You can write messages down even, right? And you can also take them to situations where you're minimizing background sounds. So avoiding things like chewing gum is probably important. And if you need to find a quieter environment, say, for example, they're not deaf, they're just hard of hearing, that you want to take them somewhere else where it's easier for them to understand you, right? If it's possible. Now, somebody with a communication disability, this breaks down in a couple of different ways, because communication disabilities affect people in a variety of different ways. So if it's somebody who has trouble with comprehension, make face-to-face eye contact with them. Watch for their understanding. So say one thing at a time, like stop and actually give them an opportunity to respond. Offer a choice or 2 options. So limit the options. They may be using something called a communication board, and on my presentation right now, I have some graphics there of what communication boards are, with just some graphics or some key things that individuals can point to. They can also spell out entire words using these communication boards. So giving them the patience and the time to be able to communicate in their own way, I think, is really important. Don't ask questions that you already know the answers to. Speak at an age-appropriate level. Please don't use baby talk when you're speaking to an adult. Use gestures, pictures, help them to understand. So even if they don't have a communication board with them, is it possible for you to have a printed out, laminated board of key things that people at your front desk would normally ask for, that they could point to? So that way, if they do indicate they have a communication disability, you at least have some graphics at which they could point to. Now, if someone's speech is affected by their disability for communication, if they can't think of the word, ask them to describe it to you. Ask for clarification when you don't understand. Listen and wait, as I've been saying for all of this. So if the person has a stutter or they have difficulty expressing themselves, don't interrupt them, and give them the time to actually, finish their thoughts. And as I mentioned, if they have a communication board, remain face-to-face with them rather than looking at the board. Allow them to provide the communication, unless they're trying to get your attention to specifically look at the item that they're pointing to. Then, of course, it's okay to look at the board. If someone has a speech challenge that's hard to understand, repeat back to them what you heard just for confirmation. And of course, most importantly, be patient with all individuals. So why is this important? Well, this is important because instead of creating sympathy for the person or feeling sorry for the person, it actually creates empathy. Empathy for understanding the situation that they're going through. We may not walk a mile in their shoes, but to understand what it's like and what they're going through is so important. It changes the focus to their abilities. Rather than focusing on what you can see or their disability, focus on what the person is capable of and what they're able to do. And most importantly, encourages an open dialogue. The second that you start to open up like this, the second that they see that there are accommodations or accessibility features in your facility, the more that they're going to feel like, okay, this is a place that I can actually feel comfortable in. These are things that this is a place that I can actually ask questions about, that kind of thing. So it's really important. And then lastly, being mindful of unintended barriers. So there are a lot of the barriers that we can see when we are kind of going through the various spaces, but there are a lot of things that we wouldn't necessarily immediately be aware of, and they can drastically impact people interacting with your business or your public space. And I say lastly, because this is lastly of the barriers component of the presentation. There's two other components at the end here, but this is really the nuts and bolts of it here. So when it comes to your parking, I want you to consider things like not reducing, when you reduce your stalls, to not reduce the accessible stalls. At the beginning of COVID, a lot of people were trying to discourage people from coming to their facilities. So they were reducing the amount of parking stalls by putting markers on them or blocking them off. But oftentimes what they were doing was actually blocking off the accessible spots, which actually works against the people who actually need to use them, right? So those hash marks there are not just there because they look cool. Those are there because that's an accessible van spot, so that if someone has a drop-off ramp or a ramp of some sort in their vehicle to let a wheelchair out or a power chair out, that they can actually safely lower the ramp. So if you have to block off spots, but we are starting to reopen now, which is really exciting, make sure that you're trying to make sure that the accessible stops are available. Retain the accessibility of them and ensure that drop-off areas are also available as well. So oftentimes that I've seen stanchions or cones put in place to block off like the drop-off areas near the front of buildings, and that's not great either, right? So just keep that in mind, that they're there for a reason, and those curb cuts are also there for a reason for people who are using crutches, canes, wheelchairs to easily get up on the curb and not necessarily have to strain their knees or their wheelchair or that sort of thing. Now, plexiglass. Well, isn't plexiglass lovely? And it is actually been good as far as the reduction of the transmission of germs. But one thing that it actually worked against is actually accessibility, because it reduces the sound that is going through. So if you do have plexiglass at your reception areas, make sure that you encourage staff to speak slowly and confidently, just face the patron who is there, and not to look away at a screen. And if you're facing that person, give them the opportunity to allow to read your lips and provide nonverbal communications. That way they have a clear understanding of what's really happening there. If you have a scrap piece of paper or a pad that is available and you're picking up that the person is having a tough time understanding you, you can write down those key words like, I need your identification, ID. You could put that down on the piece of paper and slide it over to them so they could understand that. And then, of course, ensure that lowered counter areas for the reception remain usable. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, because I go into facilities a lot where they put trash cans or say pop-up displays with pamphlets on the accessible counter, but now the accessible counter isn't accessible because when I go to roll underneath it, I'm bashing my knees up against the trash can, or I can't put my arms or lean my arms up against the counter because people just thought it was a cool place to put displays. And I'm happy to say that the Museum of Surrey is doing incredible things. They have an entire new accessible reception area that they've put in place that is completely like one half of actually it's 1/3 of the reception area there that's completely lowered, and there's no way that you would misunderstand that this is actually an accessible area here. So just keep that in mind, right? One of the things with plexiglass that's been really sort of aggravating for people, like I said, is the transmission of sound. And one of the cool things that my wife discovered being at City Hall, now, as I said, she doesn't have any form of physical disability, but my wife does have difficulty hearing sounds when there's a lot of busyness or busy environments going on. So the Take Five Cafe at City Hall, she was so frustrated at the beginning of COVID because yes, they put in plexiglass, which is totally fine, but she was having a really tough time hearing when the person was repeating back her order to her. So she barely knew what the totals were. And I remember one day she came from home from work and she was ecstatic. She said, Marco, you wouldn't believe it. They installed this two-way, dual-way communication system. The person who was the leaser of the Take Five took it upon themselves to buy one of these kits. Now, I looked up before this presentation. They vary from between $65 and $90, not very expensive, but they allow the person on the other end to obviously speak into a microphone. And then there is like a 3M strip on the other side that you can stick to the other side of the plexiglass. And when my wife was communicating with this person over the mic and she could hear them clear as day, she said to me, I ordered so much more than just my coffee that day. I ordered a muffin, I ordered a sandwich, because I was thrilled that I could finally hear everything that they were saying to me. So that's just a tip of something that you could go and be able to provide. Signage. Wow, is this important? Not only because it showcases that you're providing directions for people and giving an understanding of where the toilets are, where the elevator is, but you're actually making it so that if somebody has anxiety, they can really understand the direction of where things are with directional signage. If you do have the ability to provide, say, Braille, for example, or even tactile touch signage, it's a huge thing and it goes a long way. Now, not everybody knows or can understand Braille. So a tip that I've given to some business leaders, if you don't have Braille signage yet, one way that you can do is you can actually take string and glue and actually just use the string and glue to outline the space so that there is some form of tactile component. That way, if there is an arrow that is pointing in a particular direction, that person has the ability to at least touch the sign and feel those things. Now, of course, with COVID, I'm going to get into hygiene a little bit later. Of course, it's important to make sure that we're keeping the signage clean and all those types of things. But remember that this is very important, and not just with the signs, but also things like Braille on your business cards. There's somebody that we utilize, that I've utilized before. Her name is Joan, and she has a business called Canadian Braille Services, and she provides things like Braille business cards at super competitive rates. I think it's 10 cents per card. And even if you don't read Braille, if accessibility is important to you, it's a conversation starter. My wife, she's the Universal Design and Accessibility Specialist with the city, as I said, and all of her business cards for the city are brailled. And it actually creates a conversation with people. When she hands over her card, people go, is that Braille? And she's also told me cheekishly that people are less likely to throw away her business cards because there's a story behind it. So they feel guilty about throwing away her cards when there's Braille on it, but it also encourages them to want to learn more about Braille. And it definitely sends a message about inclusivity. And then, of course, for us wheelchair users out there or people who are shorter of stature, where you mount the sign is just as important. So yes, having it at head height for somebody who is standing is great, but also making sure that somebody who's a little bit lower could see the signage is so important as well. Because in my wheelchair, I'm about 3'5", 4 foot tall. And so I might roll past a very specific piece of sign or information just because it was way above me and I didn't see. So if you have the ability of getting sandwich boards or other ways of including signage in multiple ways, I would encourage you to do that as well. Now, when navigating the environment, it's important, obviously, we want to create our physical distancing still, but this is going to slowly start to fade away with our reopening plan, which is very exciting. But here's some measurements from the CSA guidelines for optimal accessibility. This is like the gold standard that goes above and beyond building code. Okay, so for wheelchair users, we need a minimum of most standard chairs of 850 millimeters to navigate most hallways and spaces. Now, consider logical access to things like washrooms and various other locations that someone's going to be using. Like if there are boxes on the ground, please remove those boxes so that it's not reducing the width and the space. Maintain a radius of about 1700 millimeters so that somebody, if they're using a power chair or a larger scooter or walker, they're able to make a full 360, especially when you're using things like washroom stalls. It's really important to have that extra space for transferring in and out of a wheelchair or just being able to put your equipment to the side. Now, if you're using single entrances and exits, please don't choose to block off the accessible entrance. I know that at the beginning of COVID, when our restrictions were a little bit more lax and we didn't know, I was going to the gym more regularly, and bless them, they were trying to do the right thing. They blocked off one of the entrances and said this entrance is in and this entrance is out. But the one that they did block was the accessible entrance. And recently, when I went to a pub with my wife, we went in and the entrance was accessible, but they said, we need you to exit through the back. But then when we went to the back, I was met with a flight of stairs. So remember that those exits aren't necessarily going to work for all people. And so I just asked the bartender, excuse me, is it possible if I just go back through the entrance because I'm not able to get down these stairs? And obviously, most times people are willing to make that happen. And then, of course, 1100 millimeters to avoid obstacles such as planters, chairs, and other things. These are really important to consider as you're thinking of how you're laying out your space. Now, VRI services and captions. Now, I already talked about captioning services and captioning your videos, but if a customer comes in and they appear to be deaf or hard of hearing, having communication challenges, VRI can be an option. And actually, the Museum of Surrey actually is the first location, I believe, in all of Surrey that is piloting VRI services so that an interpreter can actually come on in real time through, say, a tablet or an iPad for somebody. That way you don't have to call an interpreter in advance, right? So that's going to be really, really exciting to see how the deaf community really pick up on this and the usage of VRI services. And I'm so excited that the Museum of Surrey is one of the first to be implementing this. So it's really, really neat. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, captioning your videos or your other marketing materials can provide other ways of providing the information that captures a broader audience, right? Keeping hygiene within reach. So you might have hand sanitization stations. This is tip number 4 here, but they may not necessarily be accessible for all people. I know that a lot of these hand sanitizing stations, they think, oh, we'll use a foot pump so that people don't have to use their hands. But it's extremely difficult for me to use a foot pump in my wheelchair unless I like pop a wheelie on top of that. So having alternative options for people to use soap dispensers or hand sanitizers and not mounting it any more than 1100 millimeters from the floor, on average, that's about the reachability of somebody using a wheelchair, right? And the final tip here is when in doubt, you can hire an accessibility professional. I myself am a trained Rick Hansen accessibility professional, and which is basically a fancy term in saying that I know how to work with building managers, facility operators, and architects on looking at blueprints and going into spaces and actually understanding the accessibility from a mobility, hearing, vision, and cognitive perspective. And what this does, this is going to attract more inclusive and diverse staff and customers, obviously. It's going to differentiate you from your competition. You're going to require fewer retrofits in the future because you were working with this professional from the get-go. And again, to bring up the Museum of Surrey, they utilized my wife's skills as an accessibility professional in-house with the City of Surrey, but they're also getting a third-party assessor to come in now that my wife has given them all those tips and tricks about providing contrast on their stairway, about providing the lowered countertops, about providing VRI services, and they're going to actually get reviewed through the Rick Hansen Foundation, and fingers crossed, but I think they're going to be a gold-rated facility, which is basically the top-level facility that you can possibly be. It allows you to be a visionary in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And of course, it provides improved access for everyone, and that's a huge benefit for everybody. So it sends a message that your space is inclusive for everyone and that you want to be having them as part of your space. So if you want to learn more about that, that's again in my resources that I provided to the city. But if you go to rickhansen.com, you can learn more about their accessibility professionals, such as myself, who can come in and support your space. So what else can the professional accessibility professional do? And I'll finish with this. They provide you sort of peace of mind on your D&I strategy. So outside of the built environment, if you have somebody like myself, I have a background in understanding also hiring policies with my time with the President's Group and accessible employers. So having an accessibility professional doesn't necessarily just mean from the built environment, but looking at your paperwork, your policies, your standards, the things that you're doing within your business or your public space that really there could be policies that are preventing people and you didn't even know it from entering your space that are easy to change. It ensures that any projects, renovations, or new facilities meet that gold standard, so they don't just meet the building code, but they're going above and beyond building code, which leads me to the last point, which is setting aspirational goals and achieving RHFAC gold for all of your projects. And as I said, if you want to learn more, you can go to rickhansen.com/RHFAC to learn more, and that will help you to kind of get peace of mind in terms of what I'm talking about when it comes to accessibility professionals. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know I've been talking quite a lot here, but that summarizes my 5 tips to make your spaces more accessible for people with disabilities from the built environment perspective and just overall in our community. So thank you very much. And I will stop screen sharing now, and we're open for questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Marco, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you to the ASL interpreters for joining us today. And yeah, we can take some questions. I already see some questions in the chat box. Let's see. Okay, so the first one I see from Oana. She asked for driver's licenses. How would you handle a situation where part of the job is about transporting bulky items? That would be difficult on public transit.
100%. And actually, and that would be one of those cases where a valid driver's license would be required, right? Because it's actually part of the job expectations, right? So as long as you made that clear in your application process that this is expected and these are the reasons why, because you're expected to carry heavy or bulky items, and then the person will know whether or not that's the right application for them to apply for, right? I think it's just more about providing clarity, letting them know and being transparent right out the gate that these are going to be the expectations, because that person with a disability can't expect that you're going to have to be able to do everything to meet them where they're at. They also have to meet you where you're at as well. It's like what most businesses call up to what they call undue hardship. So as long as it's not causing undue hardship for your organization in terms of it's going to be a massive financial barrier to you or it's going to create an impact, I think that that is sort of where people have a general understanding of why it matters.
Okay, and Kyler, you can go ahead.
In Kamloops in the mid-1990s, there was an enlightened mayor who formed the Mayor's Committee on Accessibility. And just at that point, we were redesigning the museum. And I learned about it, so I went to ask their opinions. What I found was a committee of 24 people, each one representing a different accessibility issue in town. Just a brief list: physical, optical, auditory, speech, intellectual, emotional, social, age, diet, financial, mental, and some of those, like social and mental, had subcategories. This was a very powerful group. And what they were surprised at was somebody came to ask them questions, because normally they dealt with problems. And it really helped in redesigning the museum to have these people make suggestions we'd never dreamed of. One last thing I'll comment on is the Cincinnati Museum, Cincinnati's Children's Museum, had a benefactor who donated $6 million to the Children's Museum, provided it would go toward accessibility in any way they could think of. And the results were absolutely stunning. And you would never walk in and say, oh, I see, they're meeting somebody's limitations. It opened everybody's minds.
Wow, I love that example. And I have to tell you, that's exactly why being more inclusive is something that in terms of your hiring process, is something that I included, because by having people with disabilities as part of your team, as part of your staff members, you have that in-house focus group, so to speak, if the person is willing to open up about their accessibility needs. So much to your point about having a group, I know that the city of Surrey has the Measuring Up Committee, MUP, it's actually really cool that a Measuring Up is there, because again, it serves exactly with what you were saying. It's a focus group that is able to address certain issues within the city and be able to provide their perspectives from their different disability landscape, I guess you would say, or community. And it goes such a long way, which is why the city of Surrey is basically meeting the gold standard right now when it comes to accessibility. I don't know if you saw in the news recently, everyone, but the city of Surrey has made a proclamation that all civic facilities going forward from this day forward in June will now be using the Rick Hansen Foundation Gold Certification Standards for all new builds, which is a huge thing for me because I sit on the City of Surrey's advisory design panel, which is the panel that reviews all new constructions and retrofit constructions coming into the city. So to have that voice, it goes a long way. But thank you so much for giving that example. I know we're about a minute over, but if there is one more question, I'm happy to take it.
Any questions, anyone?
And that's okay. If you want to reach out to me following this presentation, I'm sure my website or email address will also be provided. You can reach me. I'll just say it. You can reach me at Marco, M-A-R-C-O, at Marco, M-A-R-C-O, PASQUA.com, MarcoPasqua.com. So it's a pretty easy email to reach out to me for. But yeah, absolutely happy to take any questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking in a group setting.
All right, thank you so much, Marco, for your time. We really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you next time.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you to the interpreter. I tried to talk as slowly as I could, so I appreciate that.
All right, have a
Okay,
great
thank
day,
you. Have a
everyone.
good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.